My parents skipped my husband's funeral to meet a psychiatrist, my mother said calmly over the phone later that evening, as if missing the burial of the man I'd loved for 38 years was the most reasonable thing in the world. I remember standing alone in my kitchen when she said it, still wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the cemetery that morning, my fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The house smelled faintly of lilies from the funeral arrangements, mixed with the lingering scent of Thomas's cedarwood aftershave that still clung to the hallway upstairs. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows of our Connecticut home, and the silence inside the house felt heavier than grief itself. A psychiatrist? I finally asked, my voice sounding distant even to me. My mother sighed the way she always did when she believed I was being difficult. Evelyn, please don't make this harder than it already is. Your father and I are worried about you. Worried about me. My husband had been dead for 6 days. 6 days since I found him sitting peacefully in his favorite leather chair in the den, reading glasses still resting low on his nose, as if he had only fallen asleep between pages of the newspaper. 6 days since the paramedics quietly shook their heads before I could even ask the question. And somehow, in the middle of all that pain, my parents had found time to schedule an appointment with a psychiatrist instead of attending his funeral. I lowered myself slowly into one of the kitchen chairs, staring at the untouched casserole dishes neighbors had dropped off all afternoon. The entire day replayed in fragments inside my head. The empty row at the chapel reserved for my parents. The sympathetic glances from Thomas's former law partners. The awkward silence when Reverend Miller asked whether my family had gotten delayed on the highway. At the time, I told myself there had to be a misunderstanding. My mother was 79. My father was 82. Maybe something had happened. Maybe one of them had gotten sick. But deep down, even then, something felt wrong. Who was the psychiatrist? I asked quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to make my stomach tighten. Dr. Keller, my father answered this time, his voice clipped and formal. He specializes in grief-related psychiatric evaluations. Evaluations. The words settled over me like ice water. I glanced toward the staircase leading upstairs to the bedroom Thomas and I had shared for nearly 4 decades. His slippers were still beside the bed exactly where he'd left them. His reading lamp was still turned on because I still couldn't bring myself to switch it off. Everything in this house still belonged to him. To us. And suddenly, for the first time since his death, my grief was interrupted by something colder. Fear. Why would you need a grief psychiatrist? I whispered. Neither of them answered immediately. I could hear muffled movement in the background, the faint clink of dishes, my mother murmuring something too low for me to understand. Then my father cleared his throat. Evelyn, he said carefully, after everything that's happened, we need to discuss what comes next. Living alone at your age can affect people in ways they don't always recognize. My blood ran cold, because in that moment, I realized they hadn't skipped my husband's funeral by accident. They had been planning something. The next morning, I woke up in the same position I had fallen asleep in, still sitting on top of the bedspread with the bedroom lamp glowing softly beside me. For a few seconds, I forgot Thomas was gone. My eyes drifted toward the bathroom door, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the shower running or the low hum of his voice as he shaved. Then the silence settled over the room again, thick and suffocating. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. 6:43 in the morning. Thomas had always been awake before 6. Even after retirement, he kept the habits of a trial attorney. Coffee by 6:15. Newspaper by 6:30. Breakfast at 7 sharp. I stared at his empty side of the bed for a long moment before forcing myself to stand. My knees ached as I walked downstairs, the old hardwood floors creaking beneath my feet. Every sound inside the house seemed louder now that he was gone. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway, the wind brushing against the windows. I started the coffee maker out of habit and immediately made enough for 2 people before realizing what I had done. Again, I poured 1 cup back into the machine slowly, watching the dark liquid disappear. Outside, the sky hung low and gray over the neighborhood. Connecticut in November always looked tired after a rainstorm. The maple trees lining our street had already lost most of their leaves, leaving the sidewalks covered in damp patches of red and brown. Thomas used to joke that New England looked beautiful even while dying for winter. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stood by the kitchen sink staring into the backyard. That was where he built the small stone patio 12 years ago. I could still picture him out there in faded jeans and work gloves, refusing to hire contractors because he insisted he could do it himself. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to look away. Around 9 o'clock, my mother arrived without calling first. She stepped into the house carrying 2 grocery bags and wearing the same pearl earrings she wore to every family gathering since I was a teenager. My father followed behind her silently, his wool coat buttoned all the way to the neck despite the mild temperature outside. Neither of them mentioned the funeral. Not once. "You look exhausted," my mother said immediately, setting the bags on the counter as though she owned the kitchen. "Have you been sleeping at all?" "Not much," I admitted. My father glanced around the room carefully before speaking. "Are you still taking those anxiety pills Dr. Morrison prescribed after your surgery?" The question caught me off guard. "Occasionally," I answered slowly. "Why?" "No reason," he said too quickly. My mother began unpacking containers of soup into the refrigerator. "People your age can react unpredictably to grief," she said in a gentle voice that somehow felt rehearsed, "especially when they isolate themselves." I said nothing. Something about the way they were looking at me made my skin prickle. Not with concern, with observation, like they were quietly taking notes I could not see. My mother placed a carton of eggs carefully onto the shelf before turning back toward me. "Have you been hearing Thomas around the house?" she asked softly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes widows imagine things at first," she replied. "Voices, footsteps, conversations." My stomach tightened. Thomas had not even been buried 24 hours, and somehow this conversation no longer felt like grief. It felt like an evaluation. I looked toward my father, hoping for some sign that I was overreacting, but he only adjusted his glasses and asked calmly, "Evelyn, have you considered selling the house?" I did not answer my father right away. I stood there holding my coffee mug while the 3 of us remained frozen in the kitchen like strangers forced into the same waiting room. Sell the house. Thomas had been gone less than a week, and already they were talking about my future as if the decisions no longer belonged to me. My mother moved closer and rested a cool hand against my arm. "Sweetheart, nobody is trying to pressure you," she said softly. "We only want what is best for you." I nodded slowly, even though every instinct inside me told me something was wrong. Thomas used to say that people revealed themselves most clearly in quiet moments, not loud ones. It was never the shouting you had to fear. It was the calm voice that arrived too quickly after tragedy. Around noon, my parents finally left. My mother hugged me tightly at the front door, while my father lingered near the walkway with his hands in his coat pockets. Before getting into the car, he turned back toward me. "You should think seriously about speaking with someone professionally," he said. "Grief can cloud judgment." Then they drove away, leaving tire tracks through the wet leaves lining the curb. The silence inside the house returned immediately. I locked the front door and leaned against it for a moment, closing my eyes. My entire body felt exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. I wandered into Thomas's study without really meaning to. The room still looked exactly as he left it. Legal journals stacked neatly. Beside his desk, his reading glasses folded carefully on top of a yellow legal pad. A framed photograph of the 2 of us standing beside Lake Champlain 15 summers ago. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of his desk and tried not to cry. Then the phone rang upstairs. I almost ignored it. Most calls since the funeral had been neighbors, distant relatives, or people asking whether I needed anything. But something about the sharpness of the ring unsettled me. By the time I reached the bedroom, the answering machine had already picked up. "Hello, this message is for Mrs. Whitmore regarding tomorrow's appointment with Dr. Keller at 11:30. Please remember to bring all previously discussed family documentation for the competency review." I froze beside the dresser. The machine clicked softly before the caller continued. "If possible, we would also appreciate copies of the medication history and behavioral notes discussed during last week's consultation." Behavioral notes. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woman paused briefly. "Please remind Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore that this evaluation remains confidential until the recommendation process is complete." The line disconnected. I stood there staring at the answering machine, while the room around me suddenly felt unfamiliar. Competency review. Recommendation process. Confidential. I replayed the message twice more just to make sure I had heard correctly. Then I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, gripping the blanket tightly in my hands. Last week's consultation. They had already met with this man before Thomas was even buried. Maybe before he even died. A cold memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 months earlier, Thomas and I had dinner with my parents at a restaurant in Hartford. At one point, my mother laughed lightly and said, "Evelyn has always been emotional. Even as a little girl, she created problems inside her own mind." Everyone at the table smiled politely except Thomas. I remembered the way his jaw tightened behind his wine glass. Later that night, driving home through the rain, he kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel and said quietly, "Your parents talk about you like you are unstable because they need you to doubt yourself." At the time, I thought he was overreacting. Sitting there alone in our bedroom, listening to the silence he left behind, I realized he may have understood my parents far better than I ever did. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the woman's voice on the answering machine repeating the same words over and over again. Competency review. Behavioral notes. Recommendation process. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to rest and walked downstairs barefoot in the dark. The house groaned softly around me with the familiar sounds of settling wood and old pipes. Thomas always loved this house at night. He used to say silence revealed truths people worked hard to hide during the day. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the rain sliding down the windows. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to revisit memories I had spent decades excusing. Growing up, my mother controlled every emotion in our house with frightening precision. If I cried too much, she called me dramatic. If I disagreed with her, she told relatives I was unstable. If I became upset after an argument, my father would quietly suggest I calm down before embarrassing myself further. By the time I turned 16, I had learned that the safest way to survive my parents was silence. Even happiness came with rules. I still remember coming home from high school after winning a statewide writing contest. I was so excited I could barely breathe. My English teacher told me I had real talent and encouraged me to apply for journalism scholarships in Boston. I burst through the front door expecting my parents to be proud. My mother barely looked up from the television before saying, "Do not get carried away, Evelyn. People like you disappoint themselves when they start believing they are exceptional." At the time, I thought she was protecting me from arrogance. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen at 67 years old, I finally understood something painful. My mother did not comfort confidence. She crushed it before it could grow. When I met Thomas at 28, he noticed the damage almost immediately. We were dating only 3 months when he asked me a question nobody had ever asked before. "Why do you apologize every time you express an opinion?" I laughed when he said it because I genuinely did not realize I was doing it. But after that, I started noticing. I apologized when choosing restaurants. I apologized when disagreeing during conversations. I even apologized for crying at my grandmother's funeral because I worried people would think I was overreacting. Thomas hated that word. Overreacting. Your parents trained you to distrust your own emotions. He told me once while we painted the guest bedroom together during our first year of marriage. That way they always remained the authority in the room. Back then, I defended them automatically. I insisted they only worried about me because I was sensitive. Thomas never argued. He would simply nod quietly and let the silence stretch between us. Over the years, small moments kept piling up like evidence I refused to examine. My mother correcting me in front of dinner guests whenever I told a story. My father reminding people that I struggled emotionally after my miscarriage 30 years earlier. Their constant insistence that Thomas was the only reason I functioned well as an adult. At family gatherings, they often spoke about me as though I were fragile glass one emotional event away from collapse. And now Thomas was gone, which meant, in their minds, so was the only thing keeping me stable. I suddenly remembered something else. About a year ago, after one particularly tense dinner with my parents, Thomas sat quietly in the car for almost 5 minutes before speaking. The streetlights reflected softly against the windshield while rain tapped against the roof. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Promise me something, Evelyn." "What?" I asked. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "If anything ever happens to me, do not let your parents decide who you are." At the time, I told him he was being paranoid. Now I realized he had been trying to warn me. The next afternoon, My mother called and invited me to dinner at their house in West Hartford. Her voice sounded unusually warm, almost careful, as though she had practiced every sentence before dialing my number. "You should not be alone tonight," she said gently. "Your father made pot roast." For a moment, I considered refusing. Something inside me no longer trusted simple gestures from my parents. But another part of me needed answers more than comfort. By 6 o'clock, I was driving through familiar suburban streets I had known since childhood. The Whitmore house looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. White shutters, perfect hedges, porch light glowing softly beside the front door. Even the brass knocker polished to the same unnatural shine my mother maintained through every season of her life. When I stepped inside, the smell of rosemary and red wine filled the air. My mother kissed my cheek lightly and took my coat, while my father adjusted the thermostat in the hallway. Everything about the evening felt too controlled, too measured. We sat down at the dining room table beneath the crystal chandelier my mother treated like a sacred object. The same chandelier I was forbidden to touch as a child because she claimed I was too careless. My father carved the pot roast carefully while my mother watched me over the rim of her wine glass. "You look pale," she said. "Are you eating properly?" "I am fine," I answered quietly. "Well," she replied with a small smile, "grief can distort reality sometimes. People stop taking care of themselves without realizing it." There it was again. That language. Reality. Stability. Awareness. Every sentence sounded less like concern and more like documentation. Halfway through dinner, my father leaned back in his chair and folded his napkin neatly onto the table. "Have you thought more about what we discussed?" he asked. "About the house?" I nodded slowly. "No," my mother exchanged a quick glance with him before speaking carefully. "Evelyn, sweetheart, nobody is questioning your intelligence. But after losing Thomas, it may not be wise for you to make major decisions alone." "I have managed my own life for 67 years, I replied calmly. "Of course," she said immediately. "But emotional trauma affects judgment. Even highly functioning people can experience instability after loss." The word landed between us like something alive. Instability. I noticed then that my father's phone was lying face up beside his plate. The screen suddenly lit up with a notification before he quickly flipped it over. But not before I caught a glimpse of the message preview. "Keller consultation documents received." My stomach turned cold. I looked down at my food and forced myself not to react. They were not even hiding it anymore. A few minutes later, my mother stood to clear the dishes while my father remained seated across from me in silence. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "You know, your mother and I have been discussing whether assisted living might eventually be healthier for you." I looked at him slowly. "Assisted living? Not immediately," he said quickly, "but eventually, depending on how things progress." Progress. As though my grief were a disease they expected to worsen. My mother returned carrying coffee cups and placed one carefully in front of me. Her eyes lingered on my face longer than necessary. "Have you had any emotional episodes since the funeral?" she asked softly. I stared at her. What does that mean? Any confusion? Memory lapses? Mood swings? Anxiety attacks? She spoke gently, almost clinically. Suddenly, I understood exactly what was happening. This dinner was not family support. It was an assessment. Every answer I gave them was being weighed, interpreted, stored away like evidence. I picked up my coffee cup slowly, careful not to let my hands shake. Then I realized something even worse. They were waiting for me to lose control. I stayed calm through the rest of dinner. That was the part my parents did not expect. My mother kept watching me carefully while she carried dessert plates into the dining room, waiting for some crack in my composure. My father asked whether I had been forgetting appointments lately, whether I ever lost track of time inside the house, whether grief had caused me to feel disconnected from reality. I answered each question slowly and politely, the same way Thomas taught me to respond to manipulative people during difficult negotiations. Never rush. Never defend yourself emotionally. Never give them the reaction they came for. By the time I drove home that evening, rain had started falling again across Hartford County. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a soft rhythm, while my thoughts spiraled louder with every mile. The worst part was not that my parents believed I was vulnerable. The worst part was realizing they had probably believed it my entire life. Thomas had simply interrupted their ability to control me. And now that he was gone, they intended to reclaim it. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the porch light glowing warmly against the darkness. Thomas always left it on whenever I drove anywhere after sunset. For a second, the sight of it nearly broke me. I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel until my breathing steadied again. Then I walked inside and locked the front door behind me. The house felt colder than usual. I hung my coat beside Thomas's in the hallway closet and froze when I noticed something tucked partially beneath the study door upstairs. An envelope. My pulse quickened immediately. I climbed the stairs slowly and picked it up from the floor. No stamp. No address. Just my name written neatly across the front in black ink. Evelyn. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Thomas. My hands started trembling as I carried the envelope into his study and closed the door behind me. For several seconds, I simply stared at it sitting on the desk beneath the green banker's lamp. Then I carefully opened the flap. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver key taped to the paper. Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you from what comes next. I stopped breathing for a moment. The room around me seemed to shrink into silence. Thomas's words continued in the steady handwriting I knew better than my own. Your parents will try to convince you that grief has made you unstable. They have spent decades defining your emotions as weakness because it allows them to maintain control. If they begin discussing evaluations, competency, or assisted living, you need to open the locked drawer in my filing cabinet immediately. Use the key. I looked toward the far corner of the room where Thomas's oak filing cabinet stood against the wall. Suddenly, every strange conversation from the past week rearranged itself inside my mind, like puzzle pieces finally locking together. My mother asking whether I heard voices. My father mentioning assisted living. The psychiatrist. The confidential evaluation. They were building a legal case around my grief. My chest tightened as I stood and crossed the room toward the cabinet. The silver key slid smoothly into the bottom drawer lock. Inside, there was only one thick manila folder with my name written across the tab. Beneath it rested a digital voice recorder and several sealed documents stamped confidential. I opened the folder carefully. The first page was a typed legal memorandum from Thomas's law office dated 8 months earlier. Subject: preliminary concerns regarding potential conservatorship attempt involving Evelyn Carter. My blood turned cold. Thomas had known this was coming long before I did. I spent the next 3 hours sitting alone in Thomas's study while rain pressed softly against the windows outside. The banker's lamp cast a warm circle of light across the desk as I carefully read every document inside the folder he left behind. Some pages were legal notes from his former law firm. Others were handwritten observations dated over the past year. The deeper I read, the colder I became. Thomas had documented multiple conversations involving my parents. Phone calls, family dinners, casual remarks that seemed harmless at the time. But when placed together, a pattern emerged so clearly it made my stomach tighten. My mother repeatedly described me as emotionally fragile to relatives. My father quietly questioned whether I was aging well after I misplaced my reading glasses during Christmas dinner. There were notes about how often they discussed my mental health whenever I left the room. One sentence from Thomas was underlined twice in dark blue ink. They are laying emotional groundwork for future incompetency claims. I leaned back slowly in the chair and closed my eyes. For years, I believed my parents were simply overprotective. Even difficult families still loved each other underneath the tension. That was what I told myself every Thanksgiving, every strained birthday dinner, every uncomfortable holiday conversation. But this folder forced me to confront something uglier. My parents did not see me as an independent woman. They saw me as a problem to manage. Another document contained information about conservatorship laws in Connecticut. Thomas highlighted several passages involving emergency petitions based on emotional instability after bereavement. Attached to the back was a yellow sticky note written in his handwriting. If they move quickly after my death, they may convince a judge you are vulnerable before you fully understand what is happening. I felt suddenly nauseated. Everything made sense now. The questions, the psychiatrist, the pressure to sell the house, even the dinner invitation. They were not grieving with me. They were collecting evidence. My eyes drifted toward the digital voice recorder resting beside the papers. For several seconds, I hesitated before pressing play. Thomas's voice filled the quiet room instantly. Calm, steady, familiar enough to make my throat ache. If you are listening to this, Evelyn, then I was right to worry. I lowered my head into my hands as his voice continued. I know you will want to believe your parents mean well. You always do. But love does not require someone to doubt their own sanity in order to receive it. I listened without moving. About 8 months ago, your father contacted an attorney friend of mine asking hypothetical questions about competency evaluations after spousal loss. He did not realize the conversation would reach me. My heart pounded harder with every sentence. At first, I hoped I was overreacting. Then your mother began making comments about your emotional state in front of neighbors and family members. Subtle comments. Strategic comments. The kind that sound compassionate while planting doubt. I stared blankly at the wall as memories replayed inside my head with horrifying new clarity. My mother telling church friends I became forgetful under stress. My father joking that Thomas was my handler during a 4th of July barbecue. Little humiliations disguised as concern. Thomas's voice softened slightly on the recording. Evelyn, none of this is your fault. Your parents spent your entire life teaching you to question your own instincts. That is why I need you to trust them now. Them, not him. My instincts. Tears finally filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep listening. Tomorrow morning, contact Naomi Bennett. Her number is inside the folder. She knows everything. I immediately searched through the paperwork until I found a business card clipped to the final page. Dr. Naomi Bennett, clinical psychiatrist, Hartford Behavioral Health Associates. My chest tightened again as I noticed Thomas had written something beneath her name in small, careful letters. She is one of the few people your parents could not manipulate. The next morning, I called Dr. Naomi Bennett at exactly 8:15. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number written on the business card, but my voice remained steady when her receptionist answered. 20 minutes later, I was driving toward Hartford Behavioral Health Associates beneath a pale gray sky that threatened more rain. The clinic occupied the 3rd floor of a quiet brick building overlooking Bushnell Park. Everything inside smelled faintly of coffee and lavender. Soft instrumental piano music drifted through the waiting room, while people sat quietly reading magazines or staring into their phones. I suddenly understood why my parents chose a place like this. It looked calm, respectable, clinical enough to make any accusations sound reasonable. At precisely 9 o'clock, a woman in her early 60s stepped into the waiting room and introduced herself as Dr. Bennett. She had silver blonde hair cut neatly above her shoulders and sharp blue eyes that reminded me painfully of women who noticed everything. Her office overlooked the park through large windows framed by cream-colored curtains. Bookshelves lined one wall, while framed medical degrees covered another. But what unsettled me most was the sympathy on her face before I even sat down. "I am very sorry about Thomas," she said quietly. I nodded once. "He told me you might contact me someday." Those words sent a chill through my chest. Dr. Bennett folded her hands carefully on the desk. "Before we continue, I need you to understand something clearly, Evelyn. Your husband was deeply concerned about your parents." I sat perfectly still. "How involved are they with Dr. Keller?" I asked. She exhaled slowly before answering. "More involved than they should be." Then she opened a thin file resting beside her notebook. "Your parents contacted Dr. Keller approximately 4 months ago requesting guidance regarding possible emotional decline related to aging and dependency." My stomach tightened. 4 months ago, Thomas had still been alive. "What exactly did they say about me?" I whispered. Dr. Bennett hesitated briefly, as though weighing how much truth I could handle at once. "They described you as emotionally volatile, easily manipulated, dependent on your husband for daily functioning. They also claimed you experienced periods of confusion and paranoia under stress." I stared at her in disbelief. "That is not true." "I know," she said calmly. "Thomas knew as well." She leaned slightly forward in her chair. "Evelyn, your parents have been attempting to establish a psychiatric narrative around you for some time now. The concern is not simply emotional manipulation anymore. It is legal positioning." The room suddenly felt too warm. I removed my coat slowly while trying to steady my breathing. "Legal positioning for what?" Dr. Bennett looked directly into my eyes before answering. "Emergency conservatorship." The word landed heavily between us. I had heard it before only in television documentaries and celebrity scandals. Conservatorship meant control, financial authority, medical decisions, property access, the right to decide whether someone was capable of managing their own life. Thomas suspected they might attempt it if he passed away first. Dr. Bennett continued carefully. "Especially given your inheritance and the size of the estate." My chest tightened instantly. Thomas's estate, the house, his retirement accounts, the trust. My parents were not simply worried about me living alone. They were trying to gain authority over everything Thomas left behind. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. Why would parents do something like this to their own daughter? Dr. Bennett remained quiet for several seconds before answering softly. Because some people confuse control with love for so long they no longer know the difference. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Dr. Bennett reached into the file beside her and carefully slid a document across the desk toward me. It was a draft petition prepared by Dr. Keller's office. My name appeared at the top beneath the words Preliminary Psychological Risk Assessment. Under concerns listed by family members, one sentence was highlighted in yellow. Subject demonstrates impaired emotional regulation following spousal death and may pose risk to her own financial judgment. My blood ran cold all over again. 3 days later, my parents invited themselves to my house again. By then, something inside me had changed completely. I still grieved Thomas every minute of every day. I still woke up reaching toward the empty side of the bed before reality settled over me like cold water. But beneath the grief now lived something sharper. Awareness. I understood exactly what my parents were doing, and for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to convince myself their intentions were harmless. When my mother arrived that afternoon carrying another casserole dish, I greeted her calmly at the front door. My father followed behind her holding a folder tucked beneath his arm. I noticed it immediately. Legal size. Thick. Organized. They sat at the kitchen table while weak November sunlight filtered through the curtains above the sink. Everything looked painfully ordinary. The same wooden table where Thomas drank coffee every morning. The same cream-colored walls we painted together 12 years ago. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different now. My mother folded her hands carefully and gave me a sympathetic smile. Evelyn, sweetheart, your father and I have been discussing ways to help reduce your stress. I nodded quietly. That is thoughtful of you. She seemed almost relieved by my calm tone. My father slid the folder gently across the table toward me. These are preliminary documents, he explained. Nothing formal yet. We only want to make sure your finances and medical needs are protected while you recover emotionally. I looked down at the folder without touching it. Across the top page, I could already see the words temporary conservatorship consideration. My chest tightened for only a second before I forced myself still. Thomas was right. They expected panic, fear, tears, any emotional reaction they could later describe as instability. Instead, I lifted my eyes calmly toward my father. You prepared legal paperwork before discussing this with me? He shifted slightly in his chair. We are trying to act responsibly. My mother leaned forward with practiced gentleness. Nobody is taking your independence away, Evelyn. This is simply temporary support until you are thinking clearly again. Thinking clearly. I almost laughed. Instead, I folded my hands neatly in my lap and studied them both in silence. For the first time, I noticed how rehearsed their compassion sounded. Every sentence carefully softened. Every concern strategically framed as protection. They had probably convinced themselves this was love. That was the frightening part. My father opened the folder and pointed toward one of the pages. Dr. Keller believes early intervention is important after traumatic spousal loss. Does he? I asked softly. Yes, my mother answered quickly. And frankly, your recent behavior has worried us. What behavior? The question lingered in the air longer than they expected. My mother blinked once before answering. Isolation, emotional withdrawal, difficulty coping. I nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. Then I stood and walked quietly into Thomas's study. Behind me, I heard both of them fall silent. When I returned moments later, I placed Thomas's digital voice recorder carefully onto the kitchen table between us. Neither of them moved. Before we continue, I said calmly, I think you should hear something. My father's expression changed instantly. Just slightly, but enough. I pressed play. Thomas's voice filled the room with steady clarity. If anything happens to me, I believe Margaret and Harold Whitmore may attempt to manipulate my wife's grief in order to gain legal control over her estate and medical autonomy. The silence afterward felt enormous. My mother's face drained of color so quickly it frightened me. My father stared at the recorder as though it had become something dangerous. Thomas's voice continued calmly through the speaker. Evelyn is psychologically sound, emotionally competent, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. Any claims suggesting otherwise should be viewed as intentional coercion. My mother finally whispered my name, but I raised my hand gently to stop her. Then, for the first time in 67 years, I looked directly at both of my parents without fear. Thomas once told me that people who truly love you never need to erase you in order to protect you, I said quietly. Now I finally understand what he meant.